And good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to Preterist Apologetics with Mike Sullivan and Don Preston. And Mike, are you guys experiencing? I know you're in Tennessee, but are you experiencing any of that horrible weather?
Oh, yes. And my wife is a travel nurse, so she's in Asheville, North Carolina,
Oh,
and they are getting trounced. She had to spend the night in the hospital because she's been staying over at Rick and Holly's because they live in the area and they're kind of letting her use one of their spare rooms, but she couldn't make it up there because of all the
I tried to call Rick this morning to check on him. I've never heard back from him today. And Jan showed me some of the videos that have been taken there at Asheville, and it's like, oh man, holy cow, that's bad news.
Yeah.
So
He said he was gonna stick it out, so hopefully he's
well,
all right.
well, Jan and I were talking, and of course, it's 3 weeks away before I'm supposed to be there. So theoretically, everything will be, subsided pretty well. But boy, it's I can testify firsthand. I was caught in a flood on one occasion, and it was frightening. I'm telling you, it was really, really frightening. Uh, it's when I was in seminary, and we used to drive from Harrison, Arkansas, back to Elkins, Arkansas, and we'd spend the weekend with my brother, who was caretaker of a farm. And the house was built prior to the Civil War, went completely through the Civil War, and was never destroyed. And it sat about 75 yards from the river. But it was, up on a knoll. And we parked my car in the driveway. Well, about 3 o'clock in the morning, we knew it was raining. We knew it had been raining for a couple of days prior to that upstream. And my brother knocked on the door and he said, Don, you better come move your car. River's rising fast. And I looked up and there was water literally lapping at the wheels of my car. And man, threw some clothes on, ran out, pulled it up on the highest part I could. And we're standing there going, okay, now what? Because we were literally watching barns, watching cows and horses be swept down river.
Yeah.
It was frightening. Well, it was 1 mile from his house back to the highway, mostly level. So we kept thinking, well, it's going to be okay. This is the highest place. And so, in all the history that we knew about it, that house had never been flooded. Well, we went back inside and to try to fix a little bit of breakfast. Next thing we know, we look out and there's water between us and the highway. We decided, and it was calm. So we grabbed what belongings we could, and we waded 1 mile, water up to our waist, sometimes just slightly below my rib cage, that 1 mile all the way back to the highway. And you'd look back and you'd still see these cows and dogs and cats and everything being swept down the river. And it's like, okay, that's enough excitement for today.
Yeah, that's scary.
Yeah, it really was. So I was so concerned when Jan was showing me all of the footage, I think it was a Pizza Hut, and the water was all the way up to the middle of the door and the signs. And I mean, that water is so incredibly powerful.
It is.
And you just, you think of the carnage that it's working. And I couldn't help but wonder if perhaps it was going to get the Biltmore Hotel or mansion that is out there at Asheville, that iconic.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
I mean, oh, it's unbelievably beautiful. I've been telling some people about it over the last couple of days, but boy, you just hate so much to see that house damaged in any way. It's such a masterpiece of architecture.
Amen. Amen. Now we know why, in Daniel 9, he likens Rome sweeping across Israel as a flood. Just the power of the metaphor there.
Well, and Isaiah does the same thing with the Assyrian destruction of the 10 northern tribes. They'll come in like a flood. And so, different commentators have commented on what a powerful symbol Noah's flood became for later generations because of the power and the devastation of a flood. No question about it. Yeah.
Amen. Amen.
All right.
So we're back in how Paul is using the Song of Moses in his epistles, and we've covered number one. We've covered how Paul in Philippians 2:15 talks about and identifies his contemporary generation as the terminal, perverse, and twisted generation of Deuteronomy 32:5 and 20. And he also contrasts, because in Deuteronomy it says that you are not my people, you have spots and blemishes, and that's referring to the apostates who would be persecuting his children, in which he would come in and avenge them later on in the text. So Paul is saying we aren't those children. We're blameless. We're the bride of Christ during the betrothal period. And then we got into number two, Paul's use of Kairos. And I think we got to, you talked a lot about 1 Corinthians 10:11.
Mm-hmm. We didn't really cover Romans 8. We really need to do that.
Yeah. Let's do that.
You know, Romans chapter 8 would take several programs to do an in-depth exegesis, but
and we've done some shows on
we've done some programs on it. We were able to share some really good insights and material. And so for anyone wanting our thoughts on Romans chapter 8 on a more in-depth basis, you can go back and look those up. But let's just take a look at something here. And Mike, what I have often observed is that most preachers begin with Romans 8:18. I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is about to be revealed in us, when in fact, that's not the beginning of the context at all. The beginning of the context, Paul, well, it starts in verse 1, obviously, but nonetheless, Paul urges them to be thankful that they're being counted worthy to experience the sufferings of Christ. This whole motif of suffering, as I've sometimes said, Paul's not talking about heart attacks. He's not talking about cancer. He's not talking about financial difficulty. He's not even talking about having teenage kids, for crying out loud.
Or adult ones.
Or adult ones. Yeah, exactly. The normal pressures, the normal stresses of life are not what Paul is concerned with. He is talking about the sufferings. The pathemata is the Greek word, and it is a word that is related to the sufferings, the persecutions of Christ. Now, it's a different word from thalipsis, persecutions, but it carries the same connotation with it. And especially in this context, you know, the New Testament writers use the term sufferings of Christ pretty often. And it is always in a context of how the first century church was experiencing the same, shall I say, martyrdom that Jesus did. Paul said, for instance, Colossians 1:24, I now rejoice in my suffering for you, and I fill up in my flesh what is lacking in the afflictions of Christ. Well, scholars have just done head over heel flips over this. Paul, what do you mean? Are you telling us Jesus didn't suffer enough? No, that's not what he's saying. Peter O'Brien, in the Word Biblical Commentary, I had it out. I've been writing an article on the end of the 70 weeks, and I posted it on the website today in regard to the filling up of the measure of sin. But Peter O'Brien says what Paul's talking about here is that in the eschatological schema, God had a measure of suffering and a measure of sin that had to be filled up. And the measure of suffering is on the part of the saints. The measure of sin is on the part of their persecutors. And Paul was saying, and this is what's so powerful to me, O'Brien points out, when Paul says, I am filling up what is lacking, it's in the emphatic mode. In other words, me personally, I'm the one filling up the measure of sin. And so this is such a critically important element for helping us understand Romans chapter 8. When Paul says you need to rejoice, and we do rejoice, he said, because we are partakers of the sufferings of Christ, and then immediately says, I reckon that the sufferings of this present time. That's the sufferings he's talking about. That's persecution. And it doesn't even apply. I know somebody's probably going to jump on this. It doesn't even apply to us today because we're not filling up the measure of eschatological suffering and persecution. That was for the first century.
So you would translate Kairos here as present instead of appointed time?
No, he uses the now time, the now Kairos, the tone, noon is the Hebrew, the Greek word for now, the now appointed time.
Okay, and that fits perfectly with how he uses it in 2 Corinthians 6:2.
Yes,
the now is just the now is.
Now is the appointed time. Exactly right. And this goes back, what you and I were sharing in messenger emails today or texting, and that when you look at, and you pointed this out, I pointed this out many times in my books, and I was sharing this. I was in a Harbor Freight today, and a good friend of mine, very religious guy, very religious, and we got to talking about church history. And he started talking about, now he's a futurist. I mean, through and through, he's a futurist. But he said something about, well, we're now in the last days. I said, well, wait a minute, Steve. I said, well, here's something we have to take note of. In the Old Testament, they foretold the last days. They never said they were in the last days. In the Old Testament, they looked for the appointed time. And I mean, he knows the Septuagint, or he's very familiar with it. He understands a lot of the concepts. I said, so in the Septuagint, he said, I know what you're talking about. I said, but in the Septuagint, they foretold the coming of the appointed time. They never once said they were living in the appointed time. They were always pointing forward to that. He goes, really? I said, yeah. I said, but now watch this. Here comes John the Baptizer saying, the time has come. And Jesus said, pardon me, the time is fulfilled. Kairos. I said, Steve, that's that word appointed. And I said, it was never imminent in the Old Testament. No Old Testament prophet ever said the kingdom of heaven has drawn near. Not one of them. But here's Jesus saying the appointed time for the kingdom had arrived. And he's going, well, that's really interesting. I never noticed that before. I said, well, you really ought to study that little Greek word kairos and how significant it is in contrast between the Old Covenant and the first century period of time. I said, Steve, we're not living in the kairos today. And he just kind of cocked his head and goes, I never thought about that. I said, you got to study it. You got to study this. So I think I piqued his curiosity a little bit, and we'll see, because he's always open to talk. He loves history, he loves biblical history, he loves all history. So every time we get together, we have a good conversation, and he's way up here when it comes to the average person in knowing history and knowing the Bible and what have you, even though he's a full-blown futurist. But I think I planted some seeds today that got him to thinking a little bit. Okay. But again, right there in Romans 8, this word kairos, the now time. And I love what N.T. Wright, N.T. Wright doesn't follow up on his own writings, but N.T. Wright says that we today need to pay more attention to Paul's use of the now time, the noon. He concentrates on the Greek word noon, and it's not high noon. It is N-U-N, which means now. Mm-hmm. And so N.T. Wright says, Paul's use of the now time stands in stark contrast to the Old Covenant time. They always talked about in the last days, in the later times, it shall come to pass. But Paul says in the now time, he was living in the time that the Old Testament prophets foretold. And folks, Mike and I talk about this a lot, but if you do not catch the power of Kairos, you are missing a boatload of incredible meaning and significance in discussion.
It's funny because we're having a Revelation study with Rick Welch, Travis, and Zach, and they wanted to speed through Revelation 1:3 real quick, and I'm like, whoa! I said, I understand. I used to do this too. This is just a time text. I said, no, this has Kairos. It's the appointed time that's near, and it's used 3 times in Revelation. We need to look at those.
Boom, boom, boom.
But we have to go to the Old Testament to see where it starts, and then and they're like, oh, okay, so that's going to be fun this Sunday. Kind of seeing
exactly what you're talking about. Zach and I did a blog yesterday. He wanted to look at 2 Corinthians 3 through 6. He wanted to focus on being absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. I said, well, that's all fine, but we've got to go back to chapter 3. You can't discuss chapter 5 in isolation, because chapter 3 through 6 is based on Ezekiel 37. And he goes, okay, well, we'll cover chapter 3 just real quick tonight. And I said, no, we won't. I said, you can't discuss 2 Corinthians chapter 3 in a 25 words or less.
Right.
Not and do justice to Ezekiel chapter 37. And so
is he wanting to go to be absent from the body is to be absent from the old covenant body, or is he trying to?
That's corporate. It's corporate. Yeah. Gotcha. So I'm looking forward to that discussion, but it's like I told him, dude, you got to pay attention, because Paul is setting the stage from Ezekiel 37 for his entire discussion of these chapters. I mean, when he climaxes in chapter 6, verse 16, and says, you are the temple of the living God, that's the climax of Ezekiel 37.
Verse 26 or 27.
Verse 26 or 27, yeah. So when you got Ezekiel 37:26, I think it is, that's the climax of his messianic prophecy. Mm-hmm. And leading up to it, he has the outpouring of the Holy Spirit to raise Israel from the dead. You have David, the lineage of David being seated on the throne. You have the new covenant, and you have the restoration,
peace,
restoration of reconciliation, which of course is Isaiah 49 that you and I have talked about. But you have all this stuff leading up to it. And the climax of it is, you're the temple of the Lord. And he quotes Ezekiel 37. Mm-hmm. So I'm really looking forward to doing these lessons with Zach. Very enjoyable. As he admitted, when I told him, I said, no, we can't do this. We can't do an entire chapter of 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and do it justice in one program. He said, well, I know that you're prone to talk a little bit.
I don't know where he would get that from.
I don't know where he got that idea at all. My wife says I can't even say hello in 25 words or less.
True.
Yeah, very, very true. Very, very true. So anyway, folks, it's really critical to understand the lead into Paul's statement of Romans chapter 8, verse 18. I reckon that the sufferings of this now time, the word present is from that Greek word noon, by the way, this present Kairos. And how much more of a lead in would we want to Romans 9 through 11 and Paul's discussion of the salvation of the remnant than to be talking about the appointed time?
Well, that, and we'll get to that in another slide. Also, Romans 12, with this idea of persecution, because he again quotes Deuteronomy 32, waiting for God to come and avenge them from their persecution, right?
Correct.
So it kind of goes back to what you're talking about here in chapter 8, ties in really well with that. But, I'm also thinking, because there's so much recapitulation between Daniel 7, Daniel 9, and Daniel 12, that persecution in Daniel 7 is just intense. I mean, Jesus talks about it in Matthew 10. He picks up on it again in the Olivet Discourse, that there has to be this intense persecution that takes place, these birth pains, before the Son of Man comes, before the books are open, before the saints inherit the kingdom, the little horn is going to wage war. And obviously this implies death and suffering and persecution for the saints. And then Daniel in the Septuagint will pick up Kairos in Daniel 9:26 and 27, and then in Daniel 12:4. But these are kind of the Old Testament background texts that Paul's readers would have in mind when he's talking about the Kairos and this suffering, right?
Yeah, Daniel, more than any other book, in such a short span of verses, if you please. You know, other books obviously use Kairos. We're not denying that at all. But when Daniel 7, 9, and 12 pack in such an intense way Kairos to speak of those eschatological times and events, then when we come to the New Testament, and I have pointed this out, Mark 4:17, when Jesus said, "The time is fulfilled." Well, that's Kairos. And F.F. Bruce points out the significance of what Jesus said here. He's saying that the appointed time, and he mentions Kairos. He really focuses in on it. And boy, there's another book. Let me see. I've got it buried here.
Can you send me that Bruce quote?
Oh, yeah, sure. Absolutely. It's a fantastic quote. Matter of fact, if you'll let me do this, I can, well, you want the quote, so I'll just send it to you.
Okay.
But I can actually read it for our.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, you can find some really good gems from Bruce. He was the one I had to buy. It was like $30 for an online book or something. But he was one that really believed that John was following the old Greek Septuagint in Revelation 1:7, because he comes as the Son of Man upon the clouds, and then right after that, he's described as the Ancient of Days, taken right from Daniel 7.
Exactly. Okay, here it is. The name of the book is "The Time is Fulfilled," Exeter Paternoster Press, 1978, on page 17. He says, quote, "These words," that is Jesus' statement, "the kingdom of heaven, the time is fulfilled, the kingdom of heaven is drawn near." These words express, among other things, the assurance that an ardently desired new order, long since foretold and awaited, was now on the point of realization. I mean, that's just really, really powerful stuff coming from such an eminent scholar. And he's focusing on the word Kairos there, that divinely appointed, long foretold, long anticipated. And in the rest of the book, he calls our attention to the fact that the number one Old Testament prophecy that allows any calculation for the time of the arrival of the kingdom is what? Daniel chapter 9.
Nice.
And so, boy, he does a good job on it.
So we talked about this, that there's an already and not yet.
Yes.
To the Kairos. Whereas in Daniel, the emphasis is on that 3.5 years, the tail end of the consummation to the Kairos. Jesus uses it in the consummation in Luke 21 and Mark 13, but like Mark 1:15 and Paul in 2 Corinthians 6:2, they use it also with the already. We've been waiting for it. It's here in Jesus's ministry right now.
Yeah, what you have, and I noticed this early on in my own studies, and I to be honest about it, I had a pretty naive view of it, but I began to notice that some passages focus more on the initiation of the time, and this is what you're saying. They focus on the initiation. Other passages focus on the consummation of the time. So you have this, to express it as you did, already but not yet. And that's what you see in so many of these things. When John the Baptizer said, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven has drawn near." Well, that's in the perfect tense in the Greek. which means, folks, it's arriving. It's, it's among us already. He wasn't saying, well, it's already been fully established.
Right.
That's not what he was saying. But he was letting them know that the long anticipated time that they had been longing for, praying for, et cetera, was now on them. And they had an obligation to prepare to enter that kingdom. And so understanding the different nuances between initiation and consummation is very important to note in whichever passage, whichever context that we might be looking at.
Let me ask you this, since you've been kind of hot and heavy in Daniel 9, can Kairos there deal with the entire 7 years of Messiah? In other words, that his earthly ministry when he's cut off, and then also the 3.5 years at the end, or is it just focusing on the 3.5 years at the end in the war?
There in Daniel chapter 7, where it says the end of the appointed time, I take that as the comprehensive of the entire 70 weeks. I think it's comprehensive. Yeah. Which obviously is focused on the ultimate consummation in verse 27, because that's the fate of the city and the people.
Okay.
So I take it in the inclusive way that this is the consummation, this is the end of the appointed time.
Okay.
The cutout time is what I'm trying to say. And the cutout time was the 70 weeks.
Okay. So the end of the 70 weeks is the appointed time.
Yes, absolutely. And then that, I think that's why he adds, an end shall be brought to the desolations. So you have two ends. Mm-hmm. You have an end of appointed time and end of desolation. These are two synchronous events. These are not, separated in time.
Right.
The end of the appointed time is the end of the concept of the desolation. The end of the desolation is the end of the appointed time.
Mm-hmm. They complement each other.
Yes, they do. They complement each other very, very, very well. And let's not forget, folks, Daniel 9 also stands behind that appointed time of Daniel 9, stands behind Romans chapter 8. Because in Daniel chapter 9, what is Daniel anticipating? He's anticipating the arrival of everlasting righteousness. Well, what is the world of everlasting righteousness? Is that not the redemption of creation? Is that not the new creation? I don't know of anybody that really denies that, to be honest about it, although it's been kind of fascinating to me over the years, Mike, of how few commentators correlate Daniel 9 and the bringing in of everlasting righteousness with Romans chapter 8.
Yeah. I was thinking Daniel chapter 7, still with Mark 1:15. I got all excited about this, but I guess you had underlined it in something. And I was making this chart between Daniel 7, Daniel 9, Daniel 12 with all the parallels. And I was like, it's a shame that I can't find Kairos in Daniel 7, because that would make it would just make everything right. And I started looking and I'd remembered, but isn't Daniel 2 through 7 in Aramaic? And so I did some more digging, and sure enough, Daniel 7:22, until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was given to the saints of the Most High, and the time. Now, the Aramaic word here, the cognate to it is Kairos. So it is Kairos is here. Yeah. It's just in Aramaic.
And even as many translations,
when the saints possessed the kingdom.
Yeah, the time came for the saints to possess the kingdom.
But there would be persecution before in Daniel 7 too.
Oh, absolutely.
You've got everything you need right there in Daniel 7. That lays the foundation for Romans 8.
Yeah. The common theme, the common timeline in Jewish eschatology is very clear. Emil Schur, in his book, The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah, points out that in the Jewish eschatology, there's a common theme that there was to be a time of intense persecution before the coming of the Lord and the resurrection. Well,
pains.
That's where you find that everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Brent Petrie, in his marvelous book, Jesus, Tribulation, and the End of Exile, says that in every prophecy, I pointed this out in my presentation at Jonesboro. I had the quote from his book. In every single Old Testament prophecy of resurrection. Now, some people like to argue about Job is different, but that's a debatable text. But the point of it is, here is Brent Petrie saying every single Old Testament prophecy of the resurrection is preceded by the Great Tribulation. Well, guess what we find in the New Testament? Well, then shall be great tribulation, such as has never been, nor ever yet shall be from that time. Matthew 24:21. Then in verse 31, he shall send forth his angels, and they shall gather together the elect. Oh, wait a minute. This is directly from Isaiah chapter 27, 12 and 13, which is a resurrection text.
Yeah. Immediately after the tribulation.
Immediately after the tribulation.
He comes and gathers.
That's exactly right. And this, boy, I got to tell you what, I know you've experienced this, especially when I have had the opportunity to get in a really good discussion with my all-millennial friends and my post-millennial friends, because 9 out of 11 or 11 out of 9 maybe of those folks say, oh yeah, the Great Tribulation was in the first century. Oh, yeah, no question.
I love it when they say that. I'm like,
yeah, thank you. Okay, here we go. Game is over. That's 99 points for us and none for you. Thank you very much.
Right.
So when you start pointing this out, you literally get the deer in the headlight look.
Mm-hmm.
And you literally get the, I didn't know that. Well, I don't blame you. I didn't know that for years and years and years. You know, it's not malevolence. It's not dishonesty. It's just a lack of study. It's a lack of connecting the dots and what have you. Sometimes that can be caused by creedal affiliations or just plain old traditions, whatever it happens to be. Maybe mom and dad didn't teach us that way, so we don't think that way. Whatever it is. But when we are confronted with this, it is absolutely undeniable. And in my book, The Resurrection of Daniel, chapter 12, verse 2, future or fulfilled, I just go down text after text after text after text after text, showing here's the Great Tribulation. Here's the resurrection. Mm-hmm. It's undeniable. Mm-hmm. And so this singular point, in my estimation, I don't think I'm being naive, but this singular point is basically fatal to both the amillennial and the postmillennial. And I would throw in the dispensationalists, they don't agree that the Great Tribulation occurred in the first century. A tribulation did, but not the real one, that type of thing. But man, I mean, you name it. Kenneth Gentry, Joel McDermott, Keith Matheson, James Jordan, you just name the figures that you want to, whether they're Reformed amillennialists or postmillennialists. There is just universal agreement among them. The Great Tribulation was in the first century. And yet they turn around, and when confronted with the things that you and I have been sharing, Mike, all of a sudden we see some radical shifts in positions. For instance, whereas Kenneth Gentry once went to Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, and argued, well, the only thing that's put into the dust is a body, a physical body to decay, and it's heresy to say otherwise. Mm-hmm. Well, Mike, what does Kenneth Gentry say about it now?
I don't know, but I remember it like it was yesterday. I was on Facebook. I said, we've asked this question 5,000 times, this guy. I'm just going to do it 5,001.
Yeah.
So I asked him, and he said, oh, no, now, and I saved it. I saved the quote because it changes over time. All right.
Oh, yeah.
But the initial response to me on Facebook was, this has nothing to do with biological or physical resurrection. Okay. Now that changed at Criswell when I asked the question there. Okay.
Oh, indeed.
And it became an already and not yet. Well,
yeah.
But, then I contacted you and you looked at his latest edition of the post-millennial thing. He shall have dominion, and like, there it is.
There
That's
it
what we've
is.
been waiting for.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question about it. And Mike, you and I know this is not bragging on us. This is just a fact. Ever since the preterists have started pointing out these inconsistencies in some of these major leaders in postmillennialism and even amillennialism, we're seeing radical, drastic changes as they twist and they turn. The latest among them is Doug Wilson in his views on Revelation chapter 11.
Yeah.
I mean, these guys are twisting and turning in the wind because they're being confronted with the inconsistencies of their own paradigm.
And here's the beauty of it is they usually won't answer our questions because they're too busy censoring us. All right. Because we're the real threat. But the problem that they're having now, Michael Brown, these all millennials, they're reading our stuff too. They're reading our critiques of partial preterism, and they're beginning to figure it out. We're going to use the full preterist arguments against these guys. So now the partial preterists have nowhere to go. And interesting that Gentry is trying to say, again, partial preterism doesn't lead to full preterism. And yet Sam Frost, his good friend.
Yep.
Now, Sam has changed his eschatology all over the place, but there's one thing Sam has been consistent on. When Sam was a partial preterist, he said partial preterism leads to full preterism. Yep. When he was a full preterist, he said partial preterism leads to full preterism. Now that he's an all-millennialist, he still says partial preterism leads to full preterism.
Yep.
Full stop. Yep. And everyone and their grandma sees it except for Ken Gentry, because Ken wants to make his legacy being the partial preterist scholar. So I don't be very, very difficult, nothing short of a miracle that God could do for sure, but to change him because he has so much invested in trying to persuade people that his position does not lead to full preterism. But like you said, I mean, Daniel 12, I mean, once that's over, Matthew 13 is over. Once Matthew 13 is over, Matthew 24, 31. I mean, then
Matthew 25. I mean,
it all goes after.
Every domino falls and you can't keep from it because Matthew 13 is 1 Corinthians 15. That's just all there is to it. And it's simply undeniable. And while we're on Ken Gentry, since we do like to talk about him because he likes to talk about us so much, as heretics and, doomed to hell, anti-creedal, in his latest, shall we say, conversion, shared with you earlier, in his massive 2-volume set on the book of Revelation. I've got them laying right there. I finally got them. I thought I was one of the first to order. Turned out I wasn't. But anyway, finally got them in. And guess what? A little bit of a backstory. In his book, The Greatness of the Great Commission, he said that the millennium began in Jesus's earthly ministry, as Jesus cast out the demons, and the passage in which Matthew chapter 12, how can you enter a strong man's house except you first bind the strong man, et cetera, et cetera. That's the beginning of the millennium, at least an expression of the beginning of the millennium. Well, now in his brand new 2-volume set, they're both about this big, on the book of Revelation, he says that the millennium began in AD 70. This is a major, major shift. And, I'd really, really like for somebody to ask him if he could quote a creed on this for us.
Yeah.
Just give us one. Since we're the ones that are anti-creedal, and he's the one that is an Orthodox preterist consistent with the creeds, although he admits that in his position on Babylon, he's not creedal. Well, now in his position on the millennium, he's not creedal.
So the coming of Christ throughout the book of Revelation begins the millennium, according to him, apparently. Now, so the martyrs were raised out of Hades. Does he say that? And that they were seated on thrones? Is that how he takes that instead of Ephesians 2?
I haven't read that far yet. You
Because
know,
I think that's how Jordan did.
I think you're correct on Jordan on that, if
And
I'm not mistaken.
if so, Don, that's going to have to make him consistent, and that's going to smoke him out, because in Daniel 12, he never conceded what Jordan did. Jordan conceded this is a corporate resurrection, but Daniel himself was raised out of Hades to inherit eternal life at the parousia in God's presence.
That's Revelation 11.
Right. And he goes to Revelation 20, and he cites Revelation 20. So that's the beginning of the millennium in his views, at the parousia, when they were raised out of Hades and seated in heavenly places to rule with Christ. So he didn't take that as your typical all-millennial, post-millennial, go to Ephesians 2 and say, look, we're seated with Christ in heavenly places.
Like I said, I haven't read enough on that to know if that's
I definitely
if he's being if he's going to be consistent with tracking on that. I just haven't seen that yet. I was just so stunned to read his comments on the beginning of the millennium. But you know, justifiably, I think it's justifiable to say, if you're going to have the millennium beginning in AD 70, then that's the coming of the Lord, which he would equate with Revelation chapter 22, verse 12. Behold, I come quickly, right? Well, the trouble with that is the judgment takes place at the end of the millennium. But according to Revelation 22:12, it takes place at the parousia. The parousia is the time of the judgment. The time of the judgment is at the end of the millennium.
Yeah.
He's got some real serious problems here. You cannot make Revelation chapter 21-4 to be AD 70 without making it the coming of the Lord. Now, we both know that Kenneth Gentry says, well, yeah, AD 70 was a type, a shadow of the ultimate future coming of the Lord. Well, that doesn't work on 15 different counts so far. But nonetheless, that doesn't work in Revelation chapter 20 through 22.
Yeah, it's amazing how there is no coming of Christ in the book of Revelation itself that ends the millennium for this poor guy.
Obviously not. There's a judgment.
Even Thomas Ice said that. He says, Ken, where is the second coming that ends the millennium in the book of Revelation?
Yeah.
Well, it's between these two verses here, but there's no reference to his coming.
No.
And so he has to import it from 1 Corinthians 15 or 1 Thessalonians 4 or Acts 1:11, which is, to me, just damning to his view, because if you believe that the second coming of Christ ends the millennium in Revelation 20, it should be in Revelation itself.
Sure.
But we have it in Daniel 7:13, because if you look at verse 9, especially verse 10, when he comes upon the clouds, verse 13, is when the books are opened. And that's what happens at the end of the millennium in Revelation 20, 12 and 13, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
That's when the books are open. And so you can now insert Daniel 7:13, which is Revelation 1:7. He's already told you when he's going to come to end the millennium, when the books are open, if you know the Old Testament, which his audience did.
Yes. Well, just what little I scanned and read his comments, it was just stunning to me. I mean, all of this stuff that you were just mentioning just came rampaging through my head, going, this is not going to work at all. What this strikes me as is Gentry grasping at any straw that was blowing in the wind that he could grab hold of to maintain his futurism.
Yeah.
In light of what he's seeing to the contrary.
Yes.
So anyway, that's my 2 cents worth on it. It just shows you how these futurists are really, honestly, and I keep using the word desperate, but I think that's a good term for it. I really do. And when you read the continuing quote arguments, unquote, of men like Sam Frost, you just shake your head, as they constantly appeal to church history and the creeds and what have you. And you sit back and go, dude, you're the one violating the creeds.
Yes.
I readily admit the creeds don't teach full preterism. I don't have a problem with that.
Right.
You're the one that has a problem in saying you're creedal and you're teaching stuff diametrically opposed to the creeds.
Yeah. And to maybe connect the two concepts between our study on Kairos, we would go to Revelation 22, verse 10, where John is told not to seal up the prophecy of this book, for the appointed time, Kairos, is near. Now, in verse 12, right after that, he says he's coming, he's going to judge every man according to what they've done. This is going back to Daniel chapter 12. This is when the books are open, when the dead are raised, the righteous inherit eternal life. That's the end of the millennium. And that's when he comes soon. Revelation 22:7. There's the second coming that ends the millennium.
I developed the significance of Daniel chapter 7 for understanding 1 Thessalonians 4, as well as Revelation chapter 20 in my book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air. Because the more, and look, scholars have recognized this for many, many years, folks. It's just that they've got this futures paradigm that they have to keep trying to justify. Right. Scholars have understood that Daniel 7 underlies 1 Thessalonians 4. It lies behind 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. When he comes to be glorified in his saints, to judge the persecutors. Folks, that's Daniel chapter 7 in a nutshell. Everywhere you turn in some of these major eschatological texts, we find Daniel chapter 7, and lying behind Daniel chapter 7 is the appointed time of Deuteronomy chapter 32. That's what we've been trying to share with you on this program, folks, is that there is this incredibly beautiful narrative about the appointed time that the Song of Moses speaks of three times in the song. It speaks of Israel's last days, a generation far off, many generations to come. And then twice it speaks of Israel's last days, her end time. And at that appointed end times, there would be a destruction, a fire that would burn to the foundations of the earth. It was a judgment that was stored up in the treasures of God, which is 2 Peter chapter 3, by the way. The judgment of the earth. He says this judgment is treasured up, just like it in Deuteronomy chapter 32. So in this end times, God would vindicate the martyrs. Now, let's go back to Revelation chapter 20 and the end of the millennium. Kenneth Gentry in his new book is putting the millennium as the time, if I understood it correctly, okay, I don't want to misrepresent him in any way, but if I understood him correctly, he has Revelation chapter 20 and the millennium as the time for filling up the measure of suffering on the part of the saints. Now, that's inconsistent with his view that Christ came in AD 70 to vindicate the martyrs. That would be an inherent contradiction. But if that, and I want to emphasize if, because I am going to go back and read it for about the fourth time. I read it 3 times.
He had an article that he released on the millennium that I read like 5 times. This was like a year or so ago. I didn't know what in the world he was trying to say. So I'm glad I'm not the only one.
Yeah, that might have been my problem, as I read it 3 times today myself, and I'm going,
yeah.
Wait a minute. Let me go back and read that again. Okay, wait a minute. Let me
I
go
don't
back
think
and read that
he
again.
understood what he was talking about.
Somebody, I think it was our friend Robert Cruikshank, said, "I've never seen such a word salad in all of my life."
Yeah,
that's what Robert wrote about it. So, if in fact he posits the millennium as a filling up the measure of sin, that's Daniel chapter 7. Pure and simple, because the coming of the Son of Man is to vindicate the martyrs in Daniel chapter 7. And oh, by the way, it would be in the days of the fourth kingdom, which Gentry admits is Rome.
right.
Wait a minute. You can't take the vindication of the martyrs at the end of the millennium as Daniel chapter 7, because that demands it's in the days of Rome, but you're putting the end of the millennium at the end of time. That doesn't work. That's what I mean when I said today, as I was reading it, all of these thoughts just came rushing through. I said, oh man, I need to be writing this down because I know I'm going to miss a bunch of stuff. So I've got to go back and read for the fourth and fifth and the sixth time to make sure I fully understand what he's saying about the martyrs and the millennium. So don't anybody quote me that I've said this in concrete. I believe this is what I understood. If it's not true, I will gladly apologize. I will gladly correct it and say, okay, here's Kenneth Gentry's actual position. I'll even read it from the text, even though I've read it 3 times already. But I'm more than happy to correct it if I'm wrong on this. But again, ladies and gentlemen, once you see Deuteronomy 32, vindication of the martyrs, what's Paul talking about? And yes, Deuteronomy 32 is about the vindication of the martyrs. Deuteronomy 32:43. Rejoice, O you nations, with his people, for he has avenged the blood of his saints.
His children, yes. In
Romans chapter 8, Paul talking about the sufferings of this present time, this now Kairos, and it's the sufferings of Christ. It's persecution for the cause of Christ. And he says, this suffering of the now time that he was talking about is not worthy to be compared with the glory that is about to be. By the way, let me point something else out.
Young's literal.
Yeah, Young's literal translation is very important here. But here's something also very important. Mike, as you well know, in his earlier writings on Revelation 1:9, Kenneth Gentry said, well, the word mellow means imminent. It means to be on the point of. Well,
he loved Young's literal.
He loved it at the time.
Yes,
well,
he did.
Then all of a sudden, Preterists jumped all over the top of it and said, well, Brother Gentry, you're right. You're absolutely right. Let's go to Acts chapter 24, verse 14. There's about to be, mellow in the infinitive, judgment of the living and the dead. Acts chapter 17, 30 and 31. He has appointed a day in which he is about to judge the world by the man whom he has appointed. Everywhere you look in Acts, Paul's talking about the coming judgment, the coming parousia, the coming kingdom that was about to come. So, Mr. Gentry, you are right. Mellow means about to be on the point of. So in one of his writings after that, he said, well, I once took the view that mellow meant about to be, but on closer study, I have decided that perhaps it doesn't mean that.
Now, I saw the train coming. In
other words, I saw the train coming, ladies and gentlemen. Now, in his 2-volume set, guess what he does again? He says, while it is true that mellow sometimes simply means certain, it also means imminence.
Oh, no, he flip-flopped again?
He's flip-flopped again.
He needs to go into politics. That's his real calling. Oh, man.
Gentry gives and Gentry takes away and Gentry gives back. Yes, he certainly does. When I read that, I got my magic marker out and highlighted it and put stars out beside it, and all that kind of stuff like that. So here, he just simply wants to say, yes, mellow, it can mean simply certain. He makes an argument, but it can also mean imminence. So he evidently maybe has gone back to reading some of the commentaries and some of the lexicographers. I mean, maybe he read Robert Mounce on the internet. And folks, just do a search for Robert Mounce on mellow. Go to good old Google. Just look it up. And you will find Robert Mounce is recognized as one of the great Greek scholars in the world. Robert Mounce says mellow with the infinitive indicates imminence. It means about to be on the point of. So, our former preterist friends who say, no, that's not what that means. They're now arguing against some of the best Greek scholars in the world. Of course, we already knew that.
Yeah. The futurist Greek scholars.
The futurist Greek scholars. Excellent point. Excellent point. So, folks, I hope you can see what we're tying together here on the appointed time. Here is Paul, as the chart says, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, taught that Israel's appointed time of the consummation. And we find in Matthew chapter 13, the suntelia to aeonion, the consummation of the age. What is the consummation of the age? It is the time of the harvest. The time of the harvest is the suntelia of Daniel chapter 12. The time of the end, the resurrection.
Yeah, Kairos is used in Matthew 13 as the harvest time.
Oh yeah. It's used everywhere in the New Testament.
Well, a lot of places.
and lots and lots of places. So we've only focused here on Romans chapter 8. And by the way, there's an awful lot that we've left out. There are actually 4 indicators of imminence in Romans chapter 8. Number 1, and we'll conclude on this perhaps, the sufferings of Christ, which Paul indicated that he was to fill up the sufferings of Christ. That means that you cannot fill up the measure of the sufferings of Christ after the first century. That's real clear. Just like Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 12. Paul said, I deduce, I reason, that's the meaning of the Greek there, that God has set forth us, the apostles, last of all, as men condemned to die. Boy, this is powerful. And I got into an internet discussion with one guy. He says, I don't even know how to make an argument. So I said, well, okay, let's try this argument. So he disappeared after I made my argument that I don't know how to make. So anyway, he said, all that Paul's saying is that the apostles were the least of all men. I said, no, that is not the point. Because Paul is drawing on the imagery of a triumphant march. When a Roman general, when a Roman emperor, Roman leader, whatever, went to war and they won, what did they do? They had a triumphant march. They came into the streets of Rome and they started parading their captives. And you can read any commentary on 2 Corinthians on this, 2 Corinthians 9:12, and they agree with this. This is not a preterist concept. They would start with parading slaves, then more prominent people, slave owners, then more important people. And the very last of all, was the kings, the rulers of that country. And guess what they did to them? They killed them. Paul is drawing directly on that, and he says, we, the apostles, are last in this triumphant chain, doomed to die, destined to die for Christ. To do what? Fill up the measure of sin. And as the commentators say, Paul's not affirming that the apostles were going to be the last martyrs in the world. That's not his point. It's all about filling up the measure of sin.
Right. And in Matthew 23, he says, I'm going to send you New Testament prophets.
Yeah.
And since Daniel 9:24 says that the office of prophet would stop when all prophecy would be fulfilled, you can't have another group of martyrs past AD 70. If you do, you have to have some prophets.
And that's exactly right. And, I've had someone on YouTube and Facebook today challenge me on this. And he said, well, look here at Revelation chapter 10. John said he heard 7 thunders. And the voice said, seal up that because, you're not allowed to talk about that. So he says, what that's got to mean is that there are yet other eschatological events to happen after this. Well, my response to that was, well, here's the problem with that. Number one, Daniel chapter 12 is built firmly and squarely, as Greg Beale, host of other commentators, admit is built squarely on Daniel chapter 12. And specifically Daniel chapter 12, verse 7. So what did Daniel predict? Time of the Great Tribulation, the resurrection, the time of the end, the righteous shining forth in the kingdom, the abomination of desolation. So I said, here is Revelation chapter 10 drawing directly on Daniel chapter 12, and every constituent element there of eschatology would be consummated when the power of the holy people is completely shattered. So if you're going to say that there are eschatological events beyond the seven trumpets and the seven bowls, etc., because of the sealing of the seven thunders, then you got to have another resurrection. You got to have another end of the age. You got to have another harvest. You got to have another abomination, another great tribulation. Because those are the things found in Daniel chapter 12. And he finally admitted, well, yes, Revelation 10 is built on Revelation or Daniel chapter 12. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Then where's your other eschatology based upon this? I think Greg Beale calls it, this was a literary device to emphasize the importance of everything that had gone before and everything that goes afterwards, because the seven thunders don't give us any more information. It's specifically no more information given. We're given all the information we need in the bowls and in the trumpets.
Yeah.
It's not new information. It's not more eschatology.
It's recapitulation of the same judgment.
Yeah.
With the same consummation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Amen.
So,
well, it looks like our time has, the appointed time for the end of the show has come.
Somebody did an awful lot of talking tonight.
Yeah, I don't know who that was.
I don't know who that was.
No, I don't either. Okay, well, so we kind of got into Romans 8. We'll look at Kairos here. And speaking of Daniel 12, we will look at Romans 13, 11, and 12. Read Daniel 12, 2 and 3. Note that Kairos is used in verse 4 of Daniel in the Septuagint. And then we're going to look next week at Romans 13. We're going to look at Kairos, and we're going to talk about this waking out of sleep and seeing if that might also come out of Daniel 12.
Yeah, maybe, just maybe.
Yeah. Maybe. All right, brother. Well, we'll see you next Friday.
You bet. Enjoyed it. Good night.
Good night.